America, you've still got time. It's not too late.
That's right. Remember,
It's not too late.
But now, nearly 40 years later,
You can shape your future by responding to the 2020 census.
is it too late? Too late for millions of Americans to be visible in the 2020 census. Yeah, it seems like it, because as I traveled the West Coast for this story, I kept hearing this same thing.
If you're not counted, then you don't count.
If you're not counted in the census, then you don't count.
And we know that if you aren't counted, you don't count.
And you can find versions of that same phrase dating back decades.
One of the problems in 70 was that we never communicated to everyone that it is important to be counted.
That was 1979. So why, 4 decades later, would millions of American citizens have an important part of their identity left out of the census, or possibly not be counted at all? Well, to meet someone at risk of being overlooked, I went to Seattle on a rainy Friday night to a particular street popular with sex workers. I was looking for someone who census takers would have a really hard time tracking down. But rather than begin the story there, let's first go way back to the earliest days of the census, because the census is as old as America. It's enshrined in the Constitution, a way to ensure that every 10 years we know how many Americans there are, where they are, and to a certain extent, who they are. Then use all that to determine equal representation in Congress. Seems simple, right? Except it's not. The census has been manipulated through the years to count slaves as only fractions of a person. Mixed race, too, those with disabilities, and have we ever really counted Native Americans accurately? There's also the revelation that data from the 1940 census played a big role in rounding up Japanese Americans to send to internment camps during World War II. More recently, critics blame the census for undercounting Hispanics, Black Americans, leading to creative outreach tactics.
Stand up and be counted! Census time is the time to speak up.
Even the recent battle over a citizenship question on the census continues this sort of long-running tug of war between being represented by the census and being afraid of being counted.
Exactly. Or even if you are a citizen, but there are people in your family, people in your household who aren't, you might be worried about filling the form out.
Okay, remember this phrase?
If you're not counted, you don't count.
Well, that is Gareth Conron. She studies population science at UCLA's Williams Institute, and she's troubled by the Trump administration's decision to remove planned questions from the 2020 census, which would have counted LGBTQ Americans. It would have been the first thorough count of sexual orientation and gender identity.
I think most policymakers try to be responsive to the needs of the local community, and when they don't know that somebody is there, right? If a group is invisible to them, it's hard for that group to be on their radar.
And in 2016, Congress expressed that very sentiment. Both Democrats and Republicans wrote a letter to the Census Bureau basically saying, hey, it's about time we count LGBTQ Americans in the census. Please do. 4 major government agencies did the same. The Justice Department, HUD, the EPA, and HHS all agreed. Great! The Census Bureau added questions about sexual orientation and gender identity the following March, just weeks after President Trump took office.
To the best of my ability.
But a couple weeks after that, the question that was supposed to be on the 2020 census got axed, scrubbed, with the Census Bureau calling the inclusion of the question a, quote, error, and that there was, quote, no federal data need to count LGBTQ Americans. Huh?
That's simply unfounded, particularly in relation to the Public Health Service Act, which ensures that people who have access to needed medical services. We have 2 decades of information about health disparities that impact LGBT people. For HHS to say that there's no compelling reason to collect these data simply makes no sense.
Democratic Congressman Adam Schiff has even stronger words about the reversal.
And this is how the administration is doing policy, by presidential impulsive tweet. And when you make policy that way, it's going to be policy at odds with the facts, at odds with good government, at odds with treating all Americans equally, and sadly that's what we have.
So you may have a question at this point. Why is this such a big deal? Does it really matter that LGBTQ Americans don't get a specific count in the census? In short, yes, it does matter. There's this recent survey from the Harris Poll and GLAAD, which found that 1 in 5 millennials, that's 20% of millennials, identify as LGBTQ. That's 16 million Americans. And then there's what the Census Bureau says it does with that information, which is direct the spending of more than 400 million tax dollars every year. Dollars which help people get things like education, healthcare, or simply a voice.
So it means that we remain in the dark. It means that we don't know how to target our resources. It means that people in need won't get the assistance they have every right to.
Okay, back to Seattle. That's where I attempted to connect with a transgender sex worker. Let's call her Stacey. We'd been in touch over the phone, text, and had plans to meet before she started soliciting work on a Friday night. Now, Stacey doesn't have a permanent address, no place to sleep regularly, and that makes her one of the people that census workers really struggle to count, and that's always been an issue with the census.
The Census Bureau admits the 1980 count won't be perfect.
In 1990, NBC Los Angeles reported on the difficulty of census workers spending long nights trying to count the homeless, sex workers, anyone on the margins of society. As for Stacey, her life, her work, her struggles also make her one of the people most in need of being counted. But on this rainy Friday night, it's been over an hour and still no sign of her. I didn't have any luck actually meeting up with Stacey, and others like her who I met were rather reluctant to be on camera. You're fine. You're fine. So if it's hard for a journalist to track her down, how would a census worker, the people whose job it is to meet many more people?
There still are many myths out there about LGBT people, and one is that they're all affluent, and that's certainly not the case. We see higher rates of poverty and food insecurity, particularly among some segments of the LGBT population. Among the most vulnerable are transgender people.
Transgender people like Laura Lamoon. Fortunately, she and I were able to talk, and some quick backstory on Laura: she's willingly done sex work to pay the bills. She's also unwillingly fallen into human trafficking.
So I think people, especially trans and gender nonconforming folks, we're pushed into poverty, we're pushed into poverty crimes, we're given fewer options for work, we're given fewer options to be out at our jobs. Because if the government doesn't sort of set the tone, or just the law in general, if they aren't setting the tone of like, this is normal, this is a regular thing, like we're acknowledging that trans people exist, we're acknowledging that gay people exist, then they're setting a tone for like discrimination is okay.
And discriminating against Laura also means you'd be discriminating against an accomplished writer, an educated American who studied at Berkeley.
America was allegedly founded on all these principles of like, everybody's equal, everybody matters, and we know that's totally not true. Visibility counts for a lot. Visibility means more resources in terms of just dollars, in terms of funding for nonprofits, in terms of funding for services. It sets the tone for a lot of change.
So what does the Trump administration say? That's who chose to remove the full count of LGBTQ Americans from the 2020 census. Well, I reached out to the White House twice and got no reply. The Commerce Department, who oversees the census, well, they pointed us back to a statement from 2017, which acknowledges that bipartisan letter from Congress, but decided they don't think there's any, quote, federal data need, and that they looked for something more than just a letter from Congress. The Census Bureau says it needed a, quote, legislative mandate. In other words, a law, which is the opposite answer the Bureau gave about adding a citizenship question to the census, saying it does not need a law to do that.
Tomorrow the question may be whether we should count you on the census if you're not in that community. What people don't seem to realize sometimes is that when we talk about the means justifying the ends, that tomorrow you might be the means. And we should all do our best to step into the shoes of others and understand how painful this is to people in the community that feel they don't count.
That's why Schiff is again co-sponsoring the LGBT Data Inclusion Act, which would force the census to count sexual orientation and gender identity in 2030. It has broad support in the House, a similar bill in the Senate, and there are plenty of others pushing for a congressional mandate too, like the Human Rights Campaign, which helped elect dozens of LGBTQ candidates in 2018.
LGBTQ people are everywhere. We're in every family, we're in every community, we're in every church, we're in every place of work. And folks in this country support basic fairness. And that's all that we're fighting for. No one's fighting for special rights. We're fighting for equal rights.
Although that's not a new argument.
This is a civil rights issue. We deserve to be counted. We demand to be counted.
Which just underscores the feeling for some that the exclusion of an LGBTQ specific question on the census is just
keeping check of where we are and where we're going is still our common purpose in the census.
History repeating.
I think we have to recognize that it's done very purposefully because we don't count, we don't matter to this administration.
Answer the census, we're counting on you.
One more thing here. Regardless of your sexual orientation, your gender identity, your citizenship status, make sure you fill out the census. That's because if you don't, your particular demographic or your community may be undercounted. That can lead to issues with healthcare, education, with representation in government. So no matter how you may feel about the 2020 census, make sure you fill it out so you are counted, because you do count.